This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast, where my guest is Andrew Bullock, who runs the Lavender Garden Nursery. Andrew holds the National Collection of Buddlejas and grows a huge range of lavenders and buddlejas from his nursery in the Cotswolds. We talk about how to attract pollinators to your garden, when and how to prune your buddlejas and lavenders, whether buddlejas are invasive, why lavenders are sometimes short-lived, and anything else you ever wanted to know about these two plants for pollinators. The sound quality may not be up to par as we recorded the interview on the phone, but it is worth sticking with in order to benefit from Andrew's expertise.
Okay, well, we're primarily a lavender nursery, varieties of lavender and Buddleja. What got me into this? When I was very young, and I mean young, going up to my grandparents' house after junior school, I would wait, then my mother or father would pick me up later, was every summer this lilac-covered tree would come into bloom and it would be covered in these wonderful jewels of the air. Well, the plant was a buddleja and the insects were butterflies. That's my earliest memory. And I remember thinking, wow, this is magical. So that is where it all began. I think my father, to be honest, well, he did have a box of a few butterflies he collected when he was young, back in the, 30s or 40s. But it was more to do with seeing them alive. And that's where my first interest came from.
So kind of looking at lavenders and buddlejas, are you growing those specifically for pollinators? Is that the kind of raison d'etre behind the nursery?
Yeah. When in my previous career was trying to be an actor, I used to go out with a camera photographing butterflies. That was my sort of thing. And it got into butterfly conservation, photography and butterfly conservation. Then managed to buy a small house and had a garden, and started growing plants to attract butterflies, wildlife, put a pond in, got a bit carried away as usual, and lots of varieties of lavender, lots of varieties of buddleja. And then with my then girlfriend many years ago, we, in fact, I was on a holiday in Devon with my uncle. This is interesting. Well, my father's first cousin, who's an antiques dealer, and he just talking to us, and he said, his great-grandfather, which was my great-great-grandfather, always said, if you're going to have a hobby, you've got to make it pay. And a little message came through the generations. And when we came back that summer, we thought we just need an old nursery. And this place up at Ashcroft was lying empty, been empty for years. There's a sign outside that said, open next year, open tomorrow, but it never did. So I knocked on the door. I didn't have a clue how to propagate. I just had a feeling that this wildlife thing, lavenders, buddlejas particularly, would sell. So we spoke to the then owners, who were just desperate to get anyone in to run the place, to be honest, with my idea. And they said, yeah, go for it. And it was literally overnight, I sort of took on a nursery. And I'd never propagated a plant in my life at that point. But it began. So I won't lie, lavender is the commercial crop. That's where the money is. But buddlejas are probably my greatest love. But in those days, 20 odd years ago, we said plants to attract bees and butterflies. People thought we were a bit bonkers. I probably am a bit, but you see all these things on plants to attract insects. Well, I stand by what I said then. Lavenders are the number one bee attracting plant, and butterflies will come to lavender, and buddlejas are the number one butterfly attracting plant, and bees will come to buddlejas, and everything else, yeah, you can add that. But those are the main things, and they are to this day. And now if you go to any garden centre, every plant's got a picture of a bee on it because it sells, and obviously it's making people aware. But you put lavender and buddlejas in your garden, and they will come, as it were. They'll find you. And I think every garden, irrespective whether it's in a city or a countryside, should have a buddleja. And there's no excuse now to say, they're thugs, because you can get dwarf buddlejas and they attract butterflies. And that was the catalyst for me many years ago. And it might be a catalyst for all children to get into wildlife. And it's a beautiful way to do it. Just a thought really on that one.
Definitely. So have you got the correct soil that is good for growing lavenders and buddleja where you are?
Well, yeah. I mean, we're on a Cotswold limestone hillside, and talking lavender, what we call English lavender isn't, of course, English. We just call it English because we're one of the great horticultural nations, apparently. True hardy lavender, English lavender, is native to Provence, where it grows very high up, which can be very cold in the winter, on limestone hillsides. So it's sunny and it's well drained. And that is the thing you need for lavenders. And buddlejas, they come from China, mainly, where they grow on very stony hillsides. So anyone comes in the nursery and starts talking about a lavender hedge or buddlejas, I say, right, stop. Do you have a sunny, well-drained garden? If they say, oh, no, it's a bit shady and a bit wet in the winter, I say you're in the wrong nursery, because that's the main requirements. We also do a lot of culinary herbs. And again, all herbs generally are Mediterranean. It's not the cold that kills these plants. It's wet, plaggy soil, clayey soil, and shade. That's what they don't want. So stony, sunny, doesn't matter about cold, stony and sunny are your main requirements for these plants. And also with insects, it's like butterflies. You try and grow a buddleja in the shade, it might survive, but butterflies won't come to it. They're on their little pub crawl. They're going from garden to garden looking for some nectar to drink. And your sort of beautiful, what I call jewels of the air, aristocrat butterflies that fly July, August, September, small tortoiseshells, peacocks, red admirals, commoners, painted ladies, etc. Their food plant isn't the buddleja. That's where they get the nectars from. That's what gives them the energy. But the food plant of these beautiful insects, funnily enough, is stinging nettles. That's where they lay all their caterpillars. So if you can leave a small area of stinging nettles in the sunshine, not only are you attracting the butterflies into your garden, you're also giving them somewhere to lay their eggs, and hopefully then later in the summer they'll emerge as butterflies and be in your garden and surrounding area, because insects in the world need as much help as we can give them, and particularly moths as well. There's 69 species of butterfly in Britain, but there's over 2,500 species of moth. And even up to 20, 30 years ago, you could drive around at night and there'll be dead moths all over your cars. We just don't get that anymore. The insect numbers have crashed completely. And if you get the insect numbers right, then it brings back the mammals, the bats, the birds. And what do all butterflies and moths feed on? They feed on British wildflowers and grasses. This is why if we could only bring back wildflower meadows and put wildflowers in your garden and grasses, that would give the food plant for the caterpillars of moths and butterflies. Then it all works up the food chain. There you go.
I don't know whether it's just me, this is completely anecdotal, but I've noticed that lavenders are not quite as long-lived as they might have been when I first started gardening, which was maybe nearly 15 years ago. Is that, do you think, because of climate change, or because we're having wetter winters and it's not to do with the cold, like you said, it's the wet?
Well, it might be. What do I know? All I would say is that the lavender species that a lot of people buy, and the ones that I won't say to avoid, are what we call Sticus lavenders. That's the Latin. That's named after the Sticades Islands, which used to be off the coast of France. They've now been given another name, and there's no lavender anyway because the goats grazed it all away. But I'm talking the sort of brightly covered, what they call French lavender, which is sort of purples and pinks and long wings, and you see them in garden centres in May for ridiculous prices, all in bloom, and down the local sort of florist and the hardware shop, and everybody's buying them because they look pretty. But don't think French lavender, think southern France, Spain, Portugal, Madeira, Africa, which isn't very hardy in a British winter. So if you buy these French lavenders, inverted commas, the only way to really grow those successfully is in pots or very, 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 well-drained soil. I remember a chap that I bought a lot of lavender off when I was collecting, a chap called Martin Tustin, sadly dead and gone now. But I remember him saying to me, if you're going to grow French lavenders, put them in a pot and add a bit of compost to the grit. In other words, the best draining conditions as possible. Now, this is for French Sticus lavenders. What I call the English lavender, which of course grows in France, that's the hardier varieties. And as long as they are in a sunny, well-drained position, they should last you about 10 years. But pruning is very important. I don't know if you want me to come on to that now. Well, I will come on to pruning, because this is where everybody goes wrong. Everybody goes wrong. There are two main species of lavender that you're going to grow in this country. One is called angustifolia, and that means narrow-leaved lavenders. And the cultivars, that's the varieties of this species that you see everywhere, you Hidcote, Munstead, Little Lady, Folgate, Rosier, etc. They are early flowering and sweet-scented, and they don't get too big. But their primarily their flowering time is June, July. Come August, it's pretty much all gone over. But there's always the odd flower. So what I used to say, or what I do say, is go out on the 8th day of the 8th month, which is the 8th of August, and cut your lavenders to about 8 inches high off the ground. Yes, you are going into the wood, but because you're doing it with 6 weeks of summer left, that plant will recover and put on half an inch of growth. And you are then going into the autumn, into the winter, with a lovely, neat tuffet of lavender, a lovely, neat lavender hedge. Okay? If you go, oh, there's a flower of the bees, oh, I can't prune it, and then you go out in October and cut the hell out of it, the chances are it may die in the winter. Now, do not be confused with the late flowering lavender. This is what we call intermediate lavender. It's a hybrid cross. I won't go into too much detail, but they generally get bigger and get a bit woodier, and they are still in bloom all through August. And you're obviously not going to cut those in early August. These I would prune early September, when children, grandchildren, teachers go back to school. And in fact, you could say on the 9th day of the 9th month, which is like in a few days' time. And what you do with those, you have to go slightly into the new wood, because they don't shoot from old wood. This is where we get this confusion about you can't go in the wood. Yes, you can go into the wood on the early flowering lavenders, the angustifolias, as long as you do it early enough, hence the 8th of August. The late flowering lavender, you wouldn't prune till September anyway, because it's starting to go over at the end of August. But you look on the plant and you can actually see where the colours change, and it goes from dark to light. And you go up an inch or two into that new wood and cut them then. And you've also given them a little bit of summer just to get over the shock. So what that means is they will get slightly bigger every year, but it's a slow process. What you don't do is go, oh, I'll leave them for a couple of years because they're a bit small, because then you'll have a big, leggy, woody lavender, and if you cut hard into that wood, then it isn't going to appreciate it. So there you go, two simple rules. Early flowering lavender, the angustifolias, you prune it on the 8th day of the 8th month to about 8 inches off the ground. I think that's about 20 centimetres, but 8, 20 doesn't rhyme. And then the intermediate lavender, you prune it in early September, somewhere around the 9th of the 9th, and slightly into the new wood. Job done. And if you do that, hopefully your plant should last about 10 years.
Lovely. And Buddleja, again, pruning kind of what time and how far down? And also, do you deadhead your Buddleja?
Well, yeah. The only Buddleja, if you're interested in attracting butterflies, would be the Davidii Buddleja. Without going into too much detail, Buddleja named after the Reverend Adam Buddle, who was an English naturalist of long ago. And it was named after him after he died, the genus Buddleja. But the Buddlejas were actually discovered or noted in China by a chap called Armand David. And the Davidii Buddleja was named after him, Davidii. And they're the ones that attract the butterflies. I think it was a chap, Augustine Henry or somebody, who bought the seeds back from Europe, and they ended up in Kew Gardens, and the rest is history. But these Buddlejas are very hardy, but if you go out and slaughter them too sort of early in the year, if we get incredibly cold weather like we did this last winter gone, they can suffer. In fact, I know someone who's got a collection of Buddlejas, and they lost nearly 20 plants because they'd gone out and absolutely marmalised them in February, and then we had an incredibly cold March. So if you want to guarantee not to kill your Buddleja, you wait till probably about April time, I mean, if it's snowing, obviously not. But just as spring has come, you know, and we're not going to get those -5, -6, 7, 8 frosts that can do terrible damage. That's the time to go out and cut your Davidii Buddlejas. I always say if you prune somewhere between knee and waist height, you end up with about 6 or 7 feet, a couple of meters tall, which is a nice manageable size for a Buddleja. I know some places they cut them to the ground. They may come back, they may not, you know, and I think if you do cut a Buddleja hard to the ground, you are gambling. So I would wait, in a perfect world, wait till April, and then prune them well down to sort of between knee and waist level. And that will make them flower end of July into August. And that generally is the best time for getting butterflies in the garden. Now, the one way to continue having butterflies feeding on these is to deadhead the plants. And if you constantly deadhead Buddlejas, they will constantly reflower. The second flush is never quite so big, but in some years when you get, let's say it rains all through July, funny enough this year, you need a Buddleja to be in bloom in August, and quite often they've completely gone over. But if you deadhead them, they will reflower and reflower. And also people say, oh, some Buddlejas are messy when they die. Okay, well, if you cut the flowers off as they go over, they're not going to look messy. And you know, you can have a Buddleja completely in bloom all through September. So, and if you've only got 1 or 2 Buddlejas in your garden, there's no excuse not to do it, really. If you've got 200 Buddlejas like me, then time is of the essence. But, you know, it's a good way of keeping them going, and it looks pretty as well, obviously. Do you want me to mention a few cultivar Buddlejas that might be worth putting in your garden as we're on the subject? Because I was on the RHS trials for 3 years, and we had over 200 Buddlejas at Wisley, and there was only sort of 10 or so that actually got awards, and over 3 years they were all assessed. The stalwarts, mainly Black Knight. Everybody knows Black Knight. That wonderful, rich, dark purple is a magnificent colour, and also Royal Red, which is a lovely burgundy colour. These are probably still the 2 best colours there are in Buddlejas, if you like dark. Are lighter coloured Buddlejas slightly more attractive to butterflies? I would say slightly, 5 or 10%. There's a couple that I raised at the nursery, Lilac Moon, which is a lovely creamy lilac colour, and Shire Blue, which is a creamy blue colour. And also probably they're in very good positions at the nursery, but if I was picking 2 just for butterflies, those would probably be the first 2 on my list. If you've only got a Black Knight Buddleja in your garden, butterflies will come to it. But if you've got lighter coloured ones, you know, they may be slightly more attractive. That's not to say that the wild Davidii, I mean, is probably just as good as anything, but it's a bit of a boring colour. Now there's been this fashion for dwarf Buddlejas. I dismissed it at first, thinking buy a Hebe if you want a dwarf Buddleja. But they have their place, because if people have got small gardens, and a smaller Buddleja that flowers up to 1 metre, 4 feet tall, certainly is very welcome. The Buzz series that came out, you know, probably the 2 that I think are the absolute beauties there is Buzz Velvet, which is a lovely deep cerise, reddy pink colour, not pink, reddy sort of plum colour. And the other one that I particularly value is Buzz Candy Pink, which is sort of Barbie pink colour. And that one literally only grows to about 1 metre tall. So they don't always have to be big, these Buddlejas. But if you do want some big ones, probably my favourite, and the one that got an award of garden merit, the Blue Horizon, which is this midnight blue colour, but it's not a small plant. You know, you need that to be 3 metres tall, but it's magnificent. And in the evening, when the sun's gone, just as the sun has passed, it is such a radiant blue colour. It's absolutely magnificent. And a white one, again, people say Buddlejas die messily when they're white, but if you deadhead them, the one to look for is Darrant Valley, which is named after the Darrant Valley, which I think is in Kent. And all the flowers go up, point straight up. So it's like a effervescent sort of glass of champagne, bubbles going up. That's how I describe it. Beautiful thing, but again, not a small plant. You know, it needs a bit of space, really. It's coming to the end of the season now, and as a nurseryman, probably next spring would be the time that most of these will be available from my point of view, but you can always try me. I've other ones that I raised, I crossed Black Knight and Royal Red, Loganberry Jam, which is like Black Knight but has really large panicles. That's an absolute beauty as well. But there's lots of Davidii cultivars out there. A lot were bred in America. A lot of these species crosses, because in some states in America, Buddlejas can be invasive. But always remember that Buddlejas are only invasive in this country, inverted commas, on very stony areas like a railway line or a building site. They don't go out into the open countryside. A few years ago, RHS probably got a bit sniffy, and the BBC, oh, don't plant Buddlejas, they seed everywhere. Well, they don't seed everywhere. They only seed where they natively grow in China, which is on very stony hillsides. So if you're next to an SSSI quarry, then maybe not a good idea to grow too many Buddlejas. Or if you do, just cut the flowers off when they've gone over, then they won't seed. But other than that, if you go into open countryside, you don't see Buddlejas. And I've got limestone hillsides near my nursery, and there's no Buddlejas growing wild. So, that's not an excuse anymore not to have a Buddleja. They are the #1 butterfly attracting plant. There's no two ways about it. And all our butterflies, they need us, to give them a helping hand. And what's more sort of traditionally, quintessentially summer than to be in an English garden with a Buddleja in bloom and to get one of those wonderful years, which for a while it was this year, when you can get to 50, 100 butterflies on a Buddleja. Absolutely magnificent sight.
Yeah, definitely. I had this debate actually on a previous episode and got shut down a little bit because I was saying, I do grow a lot of plants at the site where I work, and it's bar none the best plant here. Well, no, I tell a lie, actually. There's another plant that is, I think, equal to it, but it's earlier, and that's our Eupatorium, which we allow to seed around a bit. But the Buddleja is, at this time of year especially, is covered in butterflies. It absolutely is. But, you mentioned some of the species that will visit a Buddleja. It's not all species of butterfly, is it, that will visit?
Well, it's more to do with timing, because the butterflies are flying from late March right through to November, December. And funny enough, you're saying about species, what comes to mind? There is a Buddleja called a globosa, which is from Chile. And this is a monster of a Buddleja, but you get big orange balls in flower in May. And I always say to people, well, it's not much good for butterflies because you don't get many garden butterflies in your garden in May. But this year there was an influx of meadow browns. They've obviously had a good year, and not only is globosa very good for bumblebees and honeybees, it was covered in these meadow brown butterflies. And I thought, gracious, I've not seen this before. And that's a May flowering plant. So it's not that Buddlejas don't attract all butterflies. I think they do. A lot of butterflies just aren't around in June, July, August in a garden environment. Some butterflies fly on mountains, some on hillsides, and unless there's Buddlejas nearby, they're not going to come to them. But the globosa Buddleja is worth a mention because a chap called Mr. van der Weyer crossed globosa with a Davidii Buddleja at Corfe Castle in Dorset I think it was after the First World War, the 1920s. And he produced what were called Weyeriana Buddlejas after him. And this is the yellow Buddleja that you may see in people's gardens in August. And it's sort of ball-shaped like the globosa, but into the shape of the traditional Davidii Buddleja flower. And the beauty of these is they're fairly sterile, so they don't know how to seed. So what they do is keep on flowering. And you can get them in flower from August right through to November. He produced 2 crosses. One was sort of a mucky orange with a violet flush called Golden Glow. And then the second one, which I particularly like, was called Moonlight, which is sort of a butterscotch colour with a violet flush. Now, I don't know when it was, I'll say the 70s, a sport, which is, I'm sure you know, is a flower that's a different colour on a tree, came off the Golden Glow Buddleja at Boskoop Nurseries in Holland, and it was pure orange, pure yellow orange, and slightly bigger flowers. And they brought it on, and it held, and that one is called Sun Gold, and that's the one you often see in people's gardens this time of year. Very attractive to butterflies and also bees, because the flowers are the flower on the actual plant, the little flower, is actually shorter, which is very good for bumblebees again. So it's a Davidii cross with Globosa called Weyeriana, and they come into flower late in the summer. Very good for butterflies.
The other thing that you mentioned earlier, which I did want to pick up on, was that you said about moths that visit the Buddleja. And somebody actually said to me yesterday they'd passed their Buddleja in the evening and it was covered in lacewings feeding. And I did think about that. I thought we kind of witness them in the daytime normally, but they are presumably visited by pollinators, around the clock by the sounds of it.
Well, they are, and it's such a wonderful smell, the Davidii Buddleja, that sort of sweet scent of summer. And on day-flying moths as well, let's not forget that lovely hummingbird hawk moth, which a lot of people every year say, oh, it's a hummingbird. No, it's a moth, but it looks like a hummingbird and has a huge proboscis, and you can see those in good years. Last year, I think, was the most I've ever seen, and they're migrants. They come over, from Europe, Africa, Europe in the spring, breed, and then you get the second sort of brood this time of year. And yes, at night, you will get moths flying around Buddlejas. It gets a bit strange with moths because even some species of moth don't actually feed on plants, but I'm going off on one. But yeah, a Buddleja will attract moths, butterflies, and also if you do leave the seeds on them, goldfinches adore it. So in the autumn, you often see goldfinches on Buddlejas pecking for seeds. And there's lots of insects live on Buddlejas as well. We get sort of, summer migrant birds like chiffchaffs and willow warblers. You often see them dancing through Buddlejas, picking off little insects. So it's a winner all round, really, Buddlejas, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have me convinced, I have to say. And if people did want to find out more or visit your nursery and hopefully buy plants, where could they find you?
Well, there's a website there, www.thelavenderg.co.uk. It's, it's a traditional website, but that sort of tells you where we are and what we do. I mean, planting-wise for lavender and Buddlejas, probably, although, there is still time now, in the spring would be the best time to do this. And that's when my range is at its fullest. But as I say, anything you're looking for, always try me, because you never know. That's the beauty of my place. I'm an old-fashioned traditional nursery. It's plants, plants, plants. And if you're looking for a particular type of Buddleja or lavender that you just don't get, commonly seen, that's where I come into my own sort of thing. That's the sort of nurseries I like to visit, where plants are grown there, not bought in, and you get things that you just don't find anywhere else, really.
A very big thank you to Andrew for his time, and thank you very much to you for listening. This week's shout out to good people doing good work is for Premier Polytunnels. Their tunnels are really good quality in my experience, and they're very nice to deal with, so they get my recommendation. There's a link to their website in the show notes. Now here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about really nobody's favourite bug.
If there's one group of insects we're likely to despise more than any other that we see in our gardens, it'll be the flies that bite us, and in particular the mosquitoes, a ubiquitous family of flies that hunt primarily warm-blooded animals to steal a bit of blood, and whose bite causes itching and discomfort, often for many days afterwards. But why do these unpleasant little creatures want our blood, since they won't ingest it, as they only feed on plant juices and nectar? Well, it's all to do with the females, who unfortunately have to fill their bodies with blood to nourish their eggs, which won't develop inside them without being bathed in this protein-rich fluid. And over the past 200 million years, they become very adept at finding and collecting this blood. The female initially searches for potential prey by tracking down the source of carbon dioxide and skin odours that she detects from up to 100 foot away. Then, using her eyes and heat sensors, she'll home in and gently land on the exposed skin of her victim, into which she pushes her proboscis and injects saliva that not only numbs the entry point, but prevents clotting when she taps into a blood vessel and fills up her body. She'll then rest up for a few days, waiting for around 100 eggs to develop inside her, before she flies off to lay them in a small pool of still or even stagnant water, where they'll hatch into little aquatic larvae that feed on algae and detritus before emerging as adult mosquitoes 2 weeks later. Despite being a bit of a nuisance here in Britain, mosquitoes are nowhere near as problematic as some of the species that exist in warmer parts of the world, where they're responsible for transmitting more diseases than any other animal. Diseases that cause some of the most serious illnesses known to us and result in millions of deaths each year, and which mean finding effective and sustainable ways to control mosquitoes remain key objectives in our ongoing battles against global infectious diseases. But whether it's reducing the risk of being bitten here in our gardens, or being infected with a serious disease in a tropical country, the basic principle of mosquito control remains similar: to cause a break in their life cycle, either by blocking or repelling them from acquiring blood, or by removing anything unnecessary that could hold water long enough for their larvae to develop in, such as discarded cans and bottles. Yet we can also now live in hope that the incredible ability of modern-day science and medicine to overcome adversity will before too long allow us to deal with the menace of mosquitoes and the diseases they vector once and for all.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.